Last year, I held my manuscript. Do you remember that pink binder? I actually finished chapter 1 sitting at the Terra Technology Conference for the book Bricks Matter. And today what I want to do is share insights of what I learned from writing the book. But before I do, I want to tell you a little bit about the book. I wrote the book because I wanted there to be a 30-year statement around what have supply chain pioneers been able to accomplish. And when I first started writing the book, I thought that I would find that we saved cost, we lowered inventories, and we improved customer service. But I found out a very different set of things. And so to write the book, I started with interviews of 75 supply chain pioneers. Keith Harrison, who led the Procter & Gamble team for 30 years, wrote the foreword. He was one of the pioneers, and several members in this group were pioneers that helped me with the interviews. But it took me a long time to get someone to say they would publish this book. It's not easy to get a book published these days. In fact, Harvard Business Review said that they would publish my book if I never used the word supply chain. So imagine me, I'm the supply chain gal on the other end of the phone going, what? Can you repeat that? Never use the word supply chain? And they said, yeah, supply chain is so boring. No one will ever read the book. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you've gone to my heart, right? But it really made me step back and think how boring we have made this topic that should be so exciting. Our 4- and 3-letter acronyms, I go into companies that have their whole knowledge portals around how to understand the acronyms of supply chain, right? We speak our geek speak, right, around supply chain. But I really wanted this to be a translator to help companies to translate what I really care and am passionate about, this topic, supply chain, with how it affects business. I wanted a line of business leader to pick up this book and to be able to better understand the concepts that drive operational excellence. And that was my goal. And so I wrote the book over the period of time of September 2011 to June 2012. And I thought, okay, I tweeted, my manuscript's done, and I went off for a run, and I thought the world would be just fine, right? But the book has 65 case studies, and every case study has to be approved by a corporate person. And the most insightful learnings for me came from supply chain failures. We failed forward. And no company wanted me to write about their failure, right? So then I began the 3- or 4-month period of, okay, I'll change this word and, we'll get it in the book. And so I had to get all the approvals. And about December last year, I finally sighed a big sigh of relief when the book hit the presses. So it's available on digital, and it's also available in hard copy. And if anybody has one, I'd be glad to sign it. And I'd love to know your feedback. The book now has 13 5-star reviews on Amazon. It'll never be a New York Times bestseller. But it's my hope you can use it to help your executive teams better understand the language of supply chain. And what I want to do today is share some insights. So about a year ago, I started this firm called Supply Chain Insights, and what we do is we focus on quantitative research, and we're trying to tie quantitative research to financial ratios to be able to understand why supply chain matters. I spoke at a conference on Monday, and I was introduced as a contrarian. I was kind of proud of that. Yeah, I think I am a contrarian. I think I write for the early line of business leader. I write a blog. I have about 5,000 people around the world that follow my writing on the blog. All the research I do is in front of the firewall. I'd love to have you pick it up and use it. This is the book. And when we think about bricks, right, the topic of bricks, the chapter sets out that there were 3 elements of bricks that really mattered. One was our choice around assets and most executives empirically get that. Manufacturing, distribution, okay, we get that. The second was the expansion into emerging economies. And we did that very differently. And so in the book, I talk about global regional governance and how that was set up and choices that were made and the evolution of global supply chain processes. Companies say that they're global, but they're really very different. Johnson & Johnson is very different than Nestle, different than Kraft, different Procter & Gamble, and there's a lot to learn from global systems. The third was the evolution of supply chain process. About March in writing the book, I had this revelation that we don't have best practices. We have emerging practices. We celebrated 30 years of supply chain management in 2012, and the new decade lays ahead, right? And we've got to learn what happened, to unlearn, to relearn what's possible. Now let's take, for example, the Terra Technology work. I remember meeting Rob Byrne about 2004. He was very excited. He came in and he talked to me about this thing called real-time forecasting. I said, Rob, that name just doesn't fly. I said, I don't know what in the heck you're talking about, right? So he changed it to demand sensing, right? But today when I go in organizations and I see the Terra Technology implementation, you know what the #1 question I'm asked? In all of your organizations, what does Terra Technology do? Can you explain to me what that system does? It's not well understood. So then I go through the evolution of advanced planning and the fact that we thought that we could put together a formula that could break monthly forecast into daily and weekly, and that Rob has applied better statistics to give us better signals for the translation of demand. And they go, oh, is that what that does? This term forecasting, has many, many different meanings, but people really don't understand what is Terra Technology. And I think what we've got to do is elevate some of these concepts around process evolution. Now, I push Rob because I don't think they've gone far enough, right? I think that the Terra system is both a sensing and a translation tool. And I not only want to see them do transportation forecasting, but I want to see them do manufacturing forecasting. And I believe there needs to be an entire demand visibility signal that allows us to sense, shape, and translate demand. We're very early in that, right? And I also don't believe that it'll come from the big guys like SAP and Oracle, because I think that, supply chain is a very small piece of their business. And they're not going to drive innovation. I think they'll copy. And so it's important for innovators who want to drive innovative processes to work with best-of-breed providers cooperatively to drive these new processes. I believe what we need to do can't happen from the processes of the past decade, that it requires new processes and new technologies, and it requires us to not think inside out, but requires us to think outside in. And that is a huge difference. The supply chains of 30 years have worked on orders and shipments, and there's inherent latency in orders and shipments. And every time I translate an order upstream in the value chain, I add latency, I add distortion, and I amplify the signal so that it's meaningless until it gets to the suppliers or manufacturing. So if you look at the evolution of different data forms, whether it's structured or unstructured data, which I think there's this whole world of unstructured data that we need to mine, whether it's social or quality or customer service or Twitter data, I think you got to get after it. You've got to look at how do you design that supply chain outside in. And the Internet of Things, right? I was in London talking about the book, and I went to Costa Coffee, and they've put in new barista services that allow them to automatically upload every day, machine to machine, what's happening in that coffee maker so that they're getting daily data daily, right? How wonderful is that? Whether it's your vending machines or whether it's your pumps for Shell or the automation of the actual restaurants, think about the Internet of Things and how unstructured data, Internet of Things, transactional data can help us to move outside in. The order's too late. It puts us on the back foot. The translation of data into an order varies by company. For the average consumer packaged goods company, an order represents 14 days latency. For something like Claritin at Merck, it'll represent 30 to 35 days latency. And so we're basically working on old data. The traditional supply chains had latency, amplification, and the evolution of supply chain practices have really not evolved from the definition of the technologies in the 1990s, by and large, with the exception of a few best-of-breed vendors, Terra Technology being one. And so what I'm doing is I'm saying, how do we unlearn, to rethink, and to go forward? And that's what my book is about. So in doing that, I do quantitative studies. If I ever ask you to do a quantitative study, I would love to have you participate. I keep everybody's name confidential when I report the findings. All of the reports are on SlideShare. You can use them with your teams. If you fill out a study for me, I will give your team a free hour of information about the study, and we have 35 reports planned in 2013. Lots of topics. And data like this comes out of the studies. And I think this is a very telling slide. This is one of my favorite slides. I have actually run this survey question in about 4 studies, and I keep getting the same response. What are the 2 largest pain points for the individual in supply chain management? Number 1, data's everywhere, right? But people can't use it. And we can't use it because we've got lots of systems. The average company has 150 systems. And we can't use it because we have not really embraced analytics in a holistic way for self-service, really embracing cloud-based computing, and really looking at how do we use new forms of visualization. I really like what Rob has done in QlikView, right? QlikView is an in-memory processing way to actually demonstrate the data. The second thing, and the thing that keeps me up at night, is the second line about the knowledge and understanding of the executive team. We have 3 very large problems that are happening right now. The executive team never really was schooled in supply chain management. We assume they understand it, but they really don't. And I'm going to talk to you about this concept of supply chain as a system. What I see over and over again is teams go after singular metrics in absence of understanding that it's a complex system. So time after time, I go to a company and they're talking about inventory, right? And I talk to them about what is the potential of inventory? What is the right form and function of inventory? How do you right-size inventory? And all they say, well, I want to reduce it. And I'm like, inventory is part of a system. When you pull inventory, you've got to understand how you make trade-offs in the system. So for example, I went to one company and sat down on a strategy day, and he had on his board this big hairy-ass goal, BHAG, that he was going to reduce inventory by $30 million. And I said to him, how do you know that's the right target? And how do you know what the reduction of inventory is going to do to the rest of your supply chain? Maybe it should be more. But I don't see anything that defines how that affects the system. He's one of my best clients, and he invited me back, and it actually turned out to be a 2-year engagement. And at the end of that period, he said inventory should actually go up because we have a growth strategy. It's actually an agricultural company. We don't have enough actives. By having inventory and actives, we can fuel a growth strategy. And thank you very much, Laura, for having that discussion with us. But this whole definition around supply chain excellence is something that companies don't understand. And quite frankly, I've spent 9 years really studying it. And I'm going to share with you today what I think drives supply chain excellence. So what did we do in the last 30 years? I'll show you, we didn't reduce inventory. We may have improved customer service, and we really have not made a lot of progress in forecasting. What we did do was we improved revenue per employee. If you look at the generation of the 4 generations of pioneers, very early people were primarily engineers. They were almost always male. They usually worked in manufacturing. And in those days, supply chain was all about factory automation. In fact, I remember working in the factory, and we were proud that, our factory had the best automation, and we weren't really worried about connecting factory to factory, right? And then we had the evolution of multicultural teams and the expansion into global economies in the second generation of pioneers, which led to e-commerce and mobility and led to social, mobile, and we're trying to figure that out right now. But if you look at the evolution of revenue per employee, you can see that certain industries did better than others. So for example, the chemical industry did very well. Consumer packaged goods and food did not do as well, and high tech and electronics also did fairly well. Why did consumer packaged goods and food and beverage not do as well as the other two industries? Well, one of the issues was that we had a shift in power to the retailer, and we put additional resources into sales, and the technologies for the front office didn't fit us very well. And so we did a lot of automation in the back office, but the automation of the front office didn't turn out so well. And so we have not achieved the revenue per employee gains of other industries. When we look at inventory performance, if you look over the 10-year period, it's not something we can be proud of. And in fact, only the high-tech and electronics industry reduced inventory. And why did that happen? Well, there's 4 reasons. At the dawn of the last decade, they were struggling for margin. If you remember the write-offs at Cisco and the downturn in 2001, the high-tech and electronics industry took it on the chin. And they built good processes. They are the best planners. If you want to understand how to really use technologies well to plan, you'll go visit a high-tech and electronics company. The second thing is margins decay in value in this industry over time. Price is decreasing and margins matter. So if they don't manage inventory well, they're going to also really suffer in operating margin. The third thing is they made inventories a system objective across the organization. And the fourth thing is they better understand the concept of inventory at an executive team level. One time I was working at AMR, and at AMR you get a daily schedule and you go to the phone and you don't know who's going to be on the other end of the phone. And it was the Samsung executive team. I mean, it was 12 of them. And they asked me the question of how to measure forecasting and how to measure inventory and what were the best measurements. This is the executive team, right? And so I had a good discussion about mean absolute percent error versus weighted MAPE and days of inventory versus inventory turns. And I hung up the phone and I went, I have never had another executive team ask me anything to this great detail, right? Inventories mattered in high tech. I don't think we've taken them seriously in other inventories, in other industries. I think we talk about it, but when push comes to shove, we don't make it an organizational objective, and we haven't made a lot of progress. Now, one of the things that keeps me up at night is I think one of our barriers to move forward is the fact that we have a supply chain organization. I fought to get one of these. I was really proud when it happened. But one of the current barriers is that we've defined the term supply chain as logistics or distribution. And often I go and I talk about these processes from the customer's customer, the supplier's supplier, and they go, oof, it's not the supply chain's responsibility. Oh, they can't control that, right? Because the original concepts of supply chain were from the customer's customer, the supplier's supplier. It wasn't just about logistics or distribution, right? And so we have defined the supply chain department as another function. And we have too many functional barriers, right? We've built another barrier. Only 1% of companies have someone that is in charge of end-to-end processes. And I actually see a direct correlation between some of the data I'm going to present to you and those that have leadership that are looking outside in, end-to-end. So the supply chain organization for many companies has become a barrier. It's become more of a barrier in Europe than it has in North America, and it's my hope that we can correct that. Now in the evolution, this is actually one of Rob and John's slides, shows some evolution of Terra Technology companies, those with and without the use of Terra Technology, and it shows that there's an improvement in inventory. My challenge to you is I think you can take this even further through the redefinition of processes. So in this first section of my presentation, I want you to put in your mind, we don't have best practices. We have evolving practices. We have a road that's been established by our pioneers that we need to take to the next level. And one of the most fundamental principles that I thought about in writing the book is this concept that supply chain is a complex system with complex processes and increasing complexity. We talked yesterday about the increasing number of items, right? It's increased complexity. And we talk about increased process complexity. And I see a lot of writing about those two concepts. But what I think a lot of companies are missing is this idea of a complex system. In the first evolution of my thinking, I have this picture, which is actually in chapter 1 of the book, which says that most companies focus on the bottom of this, which is around waste. You know, either first pass yield, or they're looking at back orders or returns, but it's really looking at waste. Most people don't start at the top and work down. Most companies want to drive profitable growth, and it's a trade-off of revenue and cost. And there are working capital decisions, and there are new definitions around corporate social responsibility that are driving us, which get to our asset strategies, either what we're doing in R&D or what we're doing with physical assets. And then we get to the traditional measurements of forecast accuracy, customer service, and inventory. Now, there is nothing that tells me good benchmarks over the last decade on customer service. In fact, when I was at AMR Research, I benchmarked 93 companies. And I got to tell you, reported customer service and actual customer service is a lot like a woman reporting her weight on her driver's license. What's that look like? It's overstated 10 to 15%. You take the raw data and you look at the actual stuff, right? We overstate customer service. And forecast accuracy, there's not good data over the last decade. The APQC data is not good. I don't agree with the IBF data because it's self-reported. So I think it's wonderful what's happening here in reporting of forecast accuracy. We just don't have it that goes over enough of a period. So what I did was I said what I could get at was financial balance sheet data. So I said, what I think people are trying to balance on the balance sheet is trade-off between growth, profitability, cycles, and complexity. And so I built this new model, which is actually going to be in the new book that I'm going to publish this year, which says that as we try to balance this, we look very differently as companies. So these are the average studies of industries across the last decade. Notice how different companies are by growth, profitability, cycles, and complexity. And companies that have the smallest margin actually did the best in the evolution of supply chain processes. And when we look at the individual industries, and we look at who did it the best by industry, because by the way, I don't think we can put all industries in a spreadsheet and shake them up, right? Every industry, I think, has to be compared to the performance within it. You can see the chemical industry doesn't really have anyone that I would call a strong performer. Consumer electronics, you can actually see very clear leaders from laggards. Motorola was a laggard. Dell and Apple are leaders. But when we go to consumer packaged goods, and I'm going to go through this one in detail, what you see is that Procter & Gamble outperformed in revenue per employee. Colgate did better in operating margin. It would be a toss-up. Who was the leader between Procter & Gamble and Colgate? It would depend upon what you valued. What you see is Unilever is the laggard. And if you look at the actual data for the food industry, you can see that General Mills is the leader, right? But pharmaceutical, there is no leader, right? Pharmaceutical has really not been able to move forward. So I also started publishing graphs that look like this. You may feel like they look like something out of a modern art museum. But what I'm doing is I'm plotting the columns of the cycle, cash to cash, versus margin. And I'm looking here at resiliency. And you can see that the pharmaceutical companies, through the recession, this is actually one pharmaceutical company, but very characteristic of the industry, actually was lacking resiliency. Notice the increase in cash to cash. And as we look at Zimmer Holdings, which is a medical device company, medical device companies have not matured very much in this particular area. But look at CPG, look at Colgate, look at Procter & Gamble, very tight nucleus of the data. Let's look at inventory turns versus revenue per employee. This is actually consumer packaged goods. This is Procter & Gamble. This is Colgate. This is a little company called Beiersdorf. And one of the reasons why I like financial ratios, it allows me to translate across continents, across currencies, big companies versus little companies. What you can see here is we have progress moving forward, continuous improvement against revenue per employee, and also not a lot of progress against inventory turns. Beiersdorf is making some progress against inventory turns. But let's look at this slide, a totally different view because I'm looking at a different perspective of the effective frontier. Here I'm looking at cash to cash versus gross margin. Look at Unilever. Unilever totally went backwards. Look at Kraft. Sorry, Pete. Went backwards, right? Look at Kimberly-Clark. I'm actually very proud of Kimberly-Clark for the last couple of years and their improvement in cash to cash. Look at that, right? Supply chain matters, right? Kimberly-Clark is actually a company that I think has made tremendous improvement in the last 3 years. And this is an example. Now, if we take food, here's Nestle, right? Going backwards in gross margin. Made a lot of progress in cash to cash, but backwards in gross margin. And then if we look at General Mills and we look at Kellogg, we can see in this area, General Mills is actually outperforming Kellogg. And then if we look at Hershey, look at Hershey. What happened to Hershey? Hershey got really serious about inventory. They were really serious about cash to cash. They made it happen. How'd they make it happen? It wasn't because some guy said they cared about inventory. They cared about it as a system. They got really good at planning. They got really good at the use of downstream data. And they powered that inventory, right? It can be done. Often I'll go in and I'll show charts like this and people go, after they get used to the charts, right? They're kind of like, If they get used to the charts, they go, wow, we haven't really looked at our balance sheet. I'm like, we really need to hold ourselves accountable to the balance sheet. There's one company that does inventory optimization that I went to talk to them and I said, you've got 32 implementations. I can only find one implementation of the 32 that's improved inventory. What are you doing about it in the market? And they went, oh wow, we haven't really looked at the balance sheet, right? Over and over again, we've said that we're going to reduce cost, improve customer service at a project level, but we really haven't held ourselves accountable to the balance sheet. So my new book is called Supply Chain Metrics That Matter. It's actually going to be an e-book, and it's going to publish in June and October, and it's going to take 6 years of market valuation data along with my financial ratios, and it's going to give a formula by industry, and it's going to profile who's done the best on the effective frontier. What I'm trying to do is allow us to have a boardroom discussion around supply chain, around the financial metrics. And if you would like to run similar analysis for you as a peer group, I do it for free for people in my community. I learn with you, and I'd love to do that with you. The index is actually going to launch the 3rd week in April. It is a direct hit against that other top 25 because I believe that we have to look by industry, we have to look long term, and I think we've got to look at how we balance on the effective frontier of growth, profitability, cost, and complexity. So when I looked at the evolution of supply chain processes with the 75 pioneers, it made me really think about maturity and think about what had happened. The original supply chain definitions were all about the efficient supply chain, which was how do I have the lowest cost per case and how do I have the tightest cycles? But what companies found out was the most efficient supply chain could not deliver customer service or the right product, the right place, the right time. And there needed to be trade-offs. And so anytime someone says to me that they want to have an efficient supply chain, I say, be careful what you're asking for. The most efficient supply chain is not the most effective supply chain. And then we moved into a focus of the resilient supply chain, primarily driven by the downturns of the economy, really looking at how do we build supply chains that can absorb demand and supply volatility. The companies that did the best out of the Great Recession were those that were great planners, and you can actually see it to the highest degree in the high-tech and electronics numbers, and I've actually written a report about that if you're interested. In 2004, I started writing about the concepts of demand-driven when I went to AMR, and I've published probably 600 articles on demand-driven supply chains. And about once a week, somebody in the industry will write something around demand-driven. And fundamentally, a lot of people use the term and they don't understand it. And the articles will start something like this, demand-driven gives these kind of benefits, and then, this is my perspective on demand-driven, and it'll follow by, oh, by the way, buy our software or buy our consulting services. The article I'm writing in my blog post is, okay, tired of bait and switch, right? If we look at demand-driven processes are outside in. They're sensing, right? Traditional supply chains only respond. They sense demand data, they shape demand data, and they translate demand data. And you can't get that out of the box from ERP, and you can't get that out of the box from traditional advanced planning systems. We started writing in 1994. There are only 3 companies today that I think have made a lot of progress on demand-driven. Cisco Systems has probably made, in my opinion, the greatest progress. If you look at their numbers on the effective frontier, it's very, very outstanding. Came from a lot of the work that happened out of the downturn of the economy in 2001 for the redefinition of the processes, but really was because of leadership and the sensing translation across the value chain. I think Procter & Gamble has had a lot of leadership. I wish that there could be greater acceleration of those concepts out of Procter & Gamble. I love you, Procter & Gamble guys. I think Kimberly-Clark has made a lot of progress on demand-driven. I think Merck has made some progress. However, by and large, demand-driven concepts are not well understood. For most companies, it's a re-implementation. It is not something that I can just take the traditional software and say, oh, by now I'm going to be demand-driven, right? No. You've got to really redefine processes outside in, and it often requires you to investigate new technologies. It allows us to think about how we use transactional data in the form of point of sale. It allows us to think about how do we use market data to sense, translate, and also shape. And requires you to go across sales and marketing outside into the customer. And most of the time, because we define the supply chain as a department, which is often logistics, there's a barrier to going across sales and marketing to be able to look at shaping. The book says, though, demand-driven is not sufficient as an end state, that we really need to look at market-driven. And in market-driven, what I say is we've got to look market to market. One of the issues we have is escalating price volatility and the fact that we do not have sufficient orchestration and horizontal processes to be able to look at what's happening in our supplier markets and translate it in our go-to-market strategies. So the book talks about the evolution of horizontal processes, revenue management, sales and operations planning, supplier development, corporate social responsibility. And I believe corporate social responsibility is a wonderful way for us to get better balance to go across the entire supply chain. Horizontal connectors allow us to connect the functions, allow us to really start to get at the questions around value chain and value chain strategy. It also allows us to continually test and learn. With the evolution of cognitive reasoning engines and new forms of analytics, we can now go to the market, set up statistical learning, and learn from the market in near real time. These test and learn concepts. And it allows us to orchestrate demand and supply. The case study in the book is Cargill beef. There are 197 ways to cut up a cow. I didn't know that, right? I bet you didn't either. So they say, what kind of cows should I have in the feedlot based upon what people are buying? Okay, they're buying filet mignon. This kind of cow gives us the best filet mignon. And now that I have the cows in the feedlot, how do I orchestrate what I do there? You know, what's the right mix of ground beef and filet mignon, and how do I cut up the cow 197 ways? I go to the store. The other day I went to the store and pecan sandies were buy one, get one free. I looked at that end-aisle display and I said, I cannot believe this. Have you looked at the price of pecans lately? I mean, really. I think they're losing on that trade promotion. And do people really care about having pecans on a buy one, get one free? 52% of trade actually happens based upon history, right? In the book I talk about, there were two cereal companies that will remain nameless, right? In the Great Recession, one decided to promote corn and one decided to promote wheat, right? Now, I believe, you know, corn with its volatility is not something I would have gone into the market with really high promotions on. Wheat, on the other hand, was more stable. But as we look at trade promotions, as we look at price, are we really managing end-to-end? Are we looking at what's happening in our commodity markets and what's happening in our go-to-market strategies? And so that's what demand orchestration is all about. So if we think about the demand-driven network, a network that senses demand with minimal latency, with near real-time response for demand shaping and demand translation, this concept of demand latency is not well understood, and people are so wedded to orders and shipments, thinking about new processes is very difficult for them. Thinking about outside in is really a re-implementation. And as we think about market-driven, which is a step up from demand-driven, we're building those outside-in processes to an even greater degree to be able to listen, to test and learn, and to be able to drive end-to-end processes. Because most of our supply chains were designed for when oil was 1/3 the price it is today. And in 1991, in consumer packaged goods, the price of transportation outstripped the price of manufacturing. And commodity volatility is only going to get worse. So the concept of market-driven value network is shared in the book as an adaptive network that can allow us to sense and translate bidirectionally and orchestrate end-to-end. And we have demand-shaping levers, and we have market-driven orchestration levers. And these market-driven orchestration levers are things like our price-to-price orchestration, alternate bills of material, alternate sourcing, changes in assortment, and really looking at how do I change those demand-shaping levers, and requires us to get out of supply chain as a function. Isn't that fun? It's aspirational. It's not something that you're just going to go do tomorrow. But it's written as the language of business so that you can have a dialogue with the business team around it. Now, one of the things that the book also does is looks at horizontal processes, and this is some work on corporate social responsibility. In a recent study, I found it very interesting that 92% of companies have a corporate social responsibility statement. 74% of companies actually tie corporate social responsibility to their balance sheet and to their marketing efforts, saying, you know, our marketing programs are either organic or free trade or recycled products, but only 20% of companies actually hold themselves accountable for the end-to-end value chain. And if you look at the resources, right, I liked Rob's slide from Unilever, most of the resource consumption happens outside the four walls of the company. And the corporate social responsibility teams feel that they're far more knowledgeable about supply chain than the supply chain teams feel that they are about corporate social responsibility. This is a platform for us. This is a good place for us to start talking about why outside-in processes matter. Because when companies go to make action, 56% default to traditional supply chain versus really elevating the discussion. Most people do not have corporate social responsibility goals as part of sales and operations planning or part of revenue management. Most will have it as part of supplier development. So when I ask about which companies do the best in corporate social responsibility and which companies do the best in supply chain, I found it very interesting that Walmart got high grades by people in the survey on both. Unilever got high grades on corporate social responsibility. Procter & Gamble got higher grades on the actual supply chain excellence. And you can see here that other companies are off balance. So it's an opportunity for us, I think, to drive balance and to really think more holistically about supply chain, because I do believe supply chain can save the world. I worry there's not enough water. I worry that demand for food is outstripping supply. And I think we are the stewards of resources. But let's talk about the path forward, right? Our next 10 years, I think, are going to be very different than the last 30. If we look now at the world, the race is on for Africa. But talent is coming out of North America and Europe. I was recently doing a speaking tour on BRICS Matter and European universities, and I was amazed to find such a multicultural audience, right? People coming from Africa into Europe to study, China, Japan. We have a shortage of supply chain talent to be able to grow the global supply chain. And when I asked the supply chain pioneers what they thought were the tipping points, the first tipping point they thought would be talent. And I think talent is the missing link of our supply chain. The next thing they said was this evolution of compliance on safe and secure. I was at Eli Lilly the other day, and Eli Lilly is being asked to put unit-level serialization on each package that's random and like an 18-character code, alphanumeric. So imagine a machine line where every pill bottle has to have this unique code. Our supply chains weren't designed for unit-level tracking. I only know one food company that is ready for what could happen in food compliance legislation, right? Unit-level tracking, traditional supply chains aren't ready for, right? And this whole concept around embracing new forms of analytics and being able to drive into big data opportunities. I was at an Informs conference on Monday and people were talking about the big data problem. You don't have a big data problem. You're not into petabytes. Your stuff will fit into relational databases today. What you've got is a big data opportunity. You've got the opportunity with the Internet of Things and manufacturing to redefine digital manufacturing. You've got an Internet of Things to be able to go and look at outside-in processes for the actual markets and to be able to fuel new forms of analytics that's test and sense and learn. It's a big data opportunity. And so as you think about the Internet of Things and you think about the definition of digital manufacturing, tune into my research. I'm doing a lot of work in those areas, and I'd be glad to continue the discussion. Here's an infographic we published yesterday on supply chain talent. When I wrote the book, BRICS Matter, started it, the average time to get a demand planner was 3 months in the market. Today it's 9 months. We can't retread demand planners or supply planners. We've got to train them. And the talent crisis is going to get worse, not better. There are 4 drivers of the talent crisis. One is the baby boomers are retiring. Second is, good for us, there are more opportunities with people with supply chain backgrounds. The third is that the kids coming out of school aren't being able to fill the mid-management talent issue. It's a mid-management talent issue, right? They're not ready. And so we're going to have to bring them from other roles, and we're going to have to train them. And the fourth is, we're being pulled into global economies because they're not coming out of the schools there. And so as we think about training and we think about training the next generation of professionals, we got to really concentrate on how we onboard, how we train, because we can't just swap from one company to another. And I found it interesting that only 18% of companies today have training budgets for supply chain training. It's going to be the missing link for you in the next 2 years. As you create your future, what I want you to do is Don't talk the acronyms of the past. CRM, SRM. There was never any R or relationship in those technologies, right? Yeah. APS, totally going to be redefined. So I want you to rethink analytics outside in. I want you to think about market sensing, systems of commerce, and how we drive the systems of reference. The system of record is ERP, how we drive new systems of insights, and how we drive synchronization and visualization. Because this whole world of supply chain was originally based upon structured data, things that fit in rows and columns. Look at this new world, unstructured data, all of these data forms, right? Mapping, RFID codes on pallets for cold chain, GPS, social, weather, all this new data forms, increasing velocity and variety, but only if we can use it. And most of the data is piling up at the doorsteps because it doesn't fit in our traditional systems very well. We have to rethink and really start to think about how do we use unstructured data? How do we embrace new forms of analytics? I would encourage you to budget for innovation around new forms of analytics. I'm really excited about text mining, sentiment analysis, cognitive reasoning engines, demand sensing. That's not going to come from the big guys, right? And the evolution of these analytics are going to power, I think, true differentiation in the next years to come. And listening post strategies. How do we listen to all that unstructured data in the social area for marketing and use it cross-functionally, quality, and our supplier base? So that's the path forward. We talked about where we've been. The only thing we've really been able to do is improve revenue per employee. We put our shoulders back and say, let's face the new decade. Let's embrace new technologies and new processes, but let's hold ourselves accountable to the balance sheet. Let's be stewards of the environment. Let's partner with business. And when I write my next book, because I'm going to do e-books this year, but I'm going to take those e-books to a hard copy, I'm hoping we've changed so that supply chain isn't so boring. Thank you very much.